They hammered at midnight, the rhythm a primitive drumbeat under a stone roof that had been cut into the hill with picks and dynamite. Sparks flew like brief constellations. Iron sang against iron. Sweat slid into the collars of the men who bent over the glowing metal, and the small, blackened room smelled of oil and hot sand and the sharp, metallic odor of heated alloy. In the middle of that pressure and heat, a bald man with a pair of spectacles darkened by grit read the stamped numbers on a flange and mouthed them as if reciting a prayer. "No margin," he said, not to anyone in particular. "We have no margin." If you stay until the end of this account, you'll hear what happened to the men and the machines and why that night mattered. If you like histories told close to the metal, both literal and human, subscribe and stay with the story. They called the place by the innocuous name Stollen, the tunnel. It sat under a ridge that, on paper, did not exist. A lattice of service shafts, brick-lined galleries, stone ramparts bored into the earth and hidden by foliage and fog. Above it, trains still ran, and towns still slept. Below it, late in 1944 and into the bitter winter that followed, sections of an airplane were being assembled that had no business being built in the dark. The object of their labor was like no other. A jet-powered fighter whose silhouette cut the sky with ungentle angles, twin intakes and swept wings that seemed designed to outpace older thinking. For the men who hammered and milled and sat for hours staring into the grain of a heat-treated disc, it was an engine's architecture, turbine housings, compressors, bearing journals, reduced to a single requirement: survive. The engine would think of itself as a heart when the airplane took to the sky. The assemblers called that heart the beast. The engineers called it the future. Both names were uneasy with the present. Friedrich Bruckner had been recruited from a university lab in the spring of 1944. He was 37, gaunt, with the careful hands of a man who had learned to hold thin things still. On his lapel was a smear of metal dust he could never quite wash off. His title, metallurgist, Internationale Flugmotorenwerke, an alias on a forged roster, meant he was responsible for a problem that read like a series of impossible arithmetic. Blades that melted in minutes at the RPMs required, bearings that grew hot and seized, oil that darkened like tea and gave up its lubricating will. The tunnel would take in the raw metals and return an engine. Simple in cartography, impossible in practice. The men who worked the evening shift included a handful of full-time technicians and a greater number of people who were there because there was nowhere else to be. Among them was Jakub, a wiry Polish machinist whose hands moved in quick, accurate arcs. He kept a sliver of a photograph folded in his pocket. A woman, a child, the kind of image men bring into caverns to hold the interior light steady. There were also German journeymen, younger apprentices who learned to count microns by feeling the hum of a lathe, and, rarely mentioned, a few men who were not free to come and go. The workforce was a fragile assembly of expertise and coerced labor, a microcosm of the wider war industry, a reality the foreman tolerated with a silence that was part calculation, part fear. In the early months, the work was improvisation. The round-shouldered men who had welded cannon breeches could not at first imagine the tolerances a jet engine required. Where a field gun could accept a few tenths of a millimeter loss to heat, a compressor disc that was even marginally out of balance would destroy itself at 8,500 RPM. The first runs in the test cell were demonstrations of physics rather than triumph. Sheets of turbine blades fractured like brittle leaves. Bearings failed from heat creep. Seals parted under pressure and sprayed oil into the combustion chamber. The test cell, a reinforced alcove with pipes and clamps and a small window cut into its face, breathed and coughed as engines rang on their mounts. Men stood behind sledges and monitors, watching instruments, noting temperatures, writing shorthand on grease-stained pads. "Too much heat on stage 2, Bruckner reported one sleepless morning, the ink on his notes blotched with sweat. The instrument panel said, "Turbine inlet temperature 900 degrees Celsius, blade creep observed after 90 seconds." In the log, he would later write that he had thought of his mother in the kitchen, lifting a pot's lid and seeing steam curl like a ghost. He needed the same patient observation, but the pot was a turbine wheel, and the steam would not be tamed by gentleness. The technical problem glared in several guises. Early blades were made of chromium molybdenum steels hardened and tempered by tried methods. They could withstand impact and ordinary corrosion, but not the sustained red-white heat that the new combustion chamber produced. The metallurgists knew the solution lay in alloys designed to resist creep and oxidation. Nickel-chromium bases, careful additions of cobalt, small pockets of aluminum and titanium to stabilize the oxide layer. But these alloys were not merely formulas, they were processes. To form a turbine blade from a superalloy meant forging at precise temperatures, forming grain directions that favored centrifugal strength, then cooling and age-hardening in ways that would not create unwanted brittleness. Materials were scarce. The tunnel's supply chain was a clandestine thread stretched through the ruins of a shattered transport network. Ingots came in from remote smelting works hidden in valleys. Shipments were repackaged, stamped with new batch numbers, and handed over in the dark. The forge had to become economist and alchemist. Bruckner's solution was incremental. Change the alloy composition slightly, improve the vacuum degassing, then alter the forging schedule to promote directional solidification. He argued for a heat treatment that would allow the blades to form a protective oxide layer, an early life insurance against oxidation. It meant more processing time, more attention on the grinding wheel. It meant fewer blades per week, but blades that might last through the minutes that mattered. Life in the stollen had its own time signature. The drills and presses spoke in one register. The test cell's roar answered in another. In between came the small human sounds: a laugh under breath to relieve tension, the scratch of a cigarette, smoked only by those who could afford it, the low mutter of a prayer in whatever tongue a man carried into the tunnel. Food was scarce and the coffee bitter. Many nights, the workers slept on wooden benches while the machine light pooled like moons over a pavement of oil. Security in the tunnel was strict. The place was secret not only because the production needed to survive Allied radar and bombs above ground, but because secrecy was the state's currency. Men signed oaths with trembling hands, faces were checked at the door, a slight misplacement of a tool could lead to accusation of sabotage. Yet secrecy also had unintended consequences. Mistakes were hidden until they became catastrophic. When an inspector from above asked for faster output, the engineers produced improvisations, quick fixes that would not hold. The engine's temperament did not respond kindly to improvisation. The first real disaster in the cavern came with a test run in late autumn. A newly forged compressor assembly, balanced in the lathe, cryo-treated, polished by Jakob's hands, was bolted into the test rig. The pipes were sealed, gauges set. That morning, the air was thin and cold. The men who gathered felt the test's ritual as the most solemn of their duties. The engine came to life, a whine that swelled like a living thing waking. For 30 seconds, it sang cleanly. Then a shriek. One turbine blade fractured near its root and flung itself away in a fragment the size of a fist. The test cell shuddered. Sparks leapt. Oil pooled and ignited, licking along floor tiles with a hungry orange. A fire hose hissed. In the aftermath, a young mechanic, Anton, who had been 3 months on the job, was rushed to a clearing hospital.
He lived, but bore the scar of flame and a new quiet in his voice. Accidents hardened resolve. Where the politics above debated where jets should be used, fighter workhorses or jet bombers, the men in the tunnel had a narrower question: how to keep an engine from eating itself alive. Their answer was a calculus of time. Every extra minute an engine could run without shedding a blade was another chance for a pilot to reach home. Bruckner's ledger of minutes became the moral currency of his days.
The engineers began tinkering with cooling, with airflow, not merely through the compressor, but around the turbine blades themselves. It was a radical idea in that space, introducing small cooling channels within blades, allowing a metered bleed of air from the compressor to pass through. The idea prefigured later superalloy turbine cooling strategies, but in the tunnel, it was a gamble. The forging equipment was not designed for hollow blades. The process demanded precision drilling, brazing, and a sealing technique to prevent coolant leaks under violent thermal cycles. Jakob learned to drill tiny passages with a steadiness that made him proud. Bruckner drew diagrams on the back of ration cards and explained the physics in low, urgent lectures. Pressure differentials, boundary layers, heat transfer, as conversation rather than combat. After months of iterative failures, blades that cracked at the cooling inlet, seals that softened, the first hollow blade turbine ran in the Stollen's test cell. The sound changed. The engine's wail became fuller, less anxious. Instruments showed the inlet temperatures dropping by a significant margin. A weary cheer passed through the men like a current. The endurance chart that Bruckner kept, scribbled on torn paper, showed minutes stacking up in a way that felt, for once, like proof that their labor bent the laws rather than being bent by them. Production moved slowly from the forge into a small, careful assembly line. The fuselage panels were riveted together in muffled rows. Wings were bolted into frames. Fuel lines were crimped and pressure tested. Each airplane assembled in the Stollen was nearly identical and nearly impossible to justify by industrial logic. How many could you produce in a secret tunnel with limited alloys and no streamlined supply chain? But the calculus of war is not always rational. The regime wanted the new fighter out of desperation and pride, and men below ground wanted the work because it meant bread, because it meant a purpose that could be explained in a single sentence: make it fly. At moments, the aircraft seemed almost sacred to some of the men. Bruckner would walk the assembly line in the small hours and run his hand along a wing rib as if checking a pulse. "You watch," he told Jakob once, voice a whisper beneath the hum of compressors. "You will hear it when it wants to come." The first flight of an aircraft fitted with tunnel-assembled components did not happen beneath the hill. Clandestine production lines surrendered the sky to official test fields. But the tunnel's contribution reached the air in pieces. Engine cores, turbine discs, finely balanced shafts. At a nearby airfield, in a low-slung hangar with the smell of fresh oil, a jet was mated with an engine that had spent more heat cycles in the underground test cell than any above-ground workshop could sanction. Pilots who flew the craft in those first sorties described the sensation of speed in terms that belonged to myth and engineering both. A pressure at the chest, a sound like compressed thunder. The wings, steady as an animal that had learned to fly at a pace its designers could not entirely predict. Operational deployment came with the jagged reality of war. The jet speed made it a difficult target for the piston-engined fighters and anti-air batteries arrayed across contested skies. It could, in short bursts, reach altitudes and velocities that rendered many conventional tactics obsolete. Yet, the machine's advantages were blunt by the limits of numbers and logistics. A handful of jets could not change the course of campaigns dominated by fuel shortages, supply interdictions, and numerical superiority. The stollen's product, for all its engineering beauty, was a scarce commodity on a battlefield that required abundance. Alongside these technical and tactical struggles ran the ethical fissures of the production, the forced laborers who stood at lathes while guards paced above, the prisoners whose hands turned cold in winter and whose bodies bore the consequences of overwork, the families who, when the transports left for other works, simply vanished. Bruckner kept a private ledger of names, Jakob's photograph taped into the margin next to a list of measurements. But the ledger could not change policy. Discontent and grief threaded the stollen like the dust that never quite left the rafters. When Allied intelligence and bombing campaigns intensified, the tension above ground tightened into a vice. The stollen was intended to be invisible, but concealment had limits. Raw material trains were halted by bombing. Communication with the design offices on the plains grew intermittent. There were nights when the tunnel filled with the sound of distant detonations, and the men paused in their work, not from fear of immediate strike, but from the knowledge that the supply chain could be cleaved by a single raid. Yet the work continued. To stop production was to invite the suspicion of command. To continue was to feed a war machine the engineers could not wholly condone, but whose needs they had been enlisted to satisfy. The test cell run that solved the critical problem, the one that already had the circularity of myth, came not from a burst of inspiration, but from patient, stubborn correction. They had by then adjusted alloy chemistries and perfected hollow blade cooling. They had refined bearing clearances and developed an oil with somewhat better heat resilience. The endurance chart, once a ragged, insufficient friend, now showed an engine running for patterns of minutes that suggested reliability. On a wet morning, when rain tapped faintly on the hillside and the tunnel lamps threw halos like moons, the engine was brought to life. Men stood not in the immediate proximity, but in a circle that seemed to hold some fragile, ritualized space.
The engine climbed to operating RPM. Readings stabilized. No blade fractured. No oil ignited. A cheer, small at first, rose in the room and then folded into something quieter. Relief. The success meant more than technical victory. The men who had spent themselves in long night shifts pressed their palms against each other's shoulders. Bruckner allowed himself a smile that was as much exhaustion as it was triumph. Jakob, who had lost a cousin in the bombing of his town, leaned against a bench and let out a sound that was almost a laugh. Yet the glow of victory was intersected by a shadow. Beyond the tunnel and the engine, entire cities had burned, and people died in numbers that made an engineering success seem both necessary and obscene. Production increased as much as it could. The hollow blade techniques became standard practice in the tunnel. Quality control improved. Engines ran longer in test beds. Some of the assembled components were shipped undercover to other dispersed plants. Some were installed in jets that flew sorties over the Reich and the contested territories. Reports filtered back, some optimistic, some brutally honest. Pilots praised the speed but warned of fuel consumption and maintenance demands that slid the jet into unpredictability. The stollen's craftsmen accepted both praise and critique. Their job had not been to judge deployment, but to perfect function. As winter deepened and resources tightened, the men in the tunnel felt the war's arc bend toward an ending that none of them could define. Individuals' fates diverged. Some engineers were reassigned, shuffled into other facilities as production was fragmented to avoid targeted bombing. Some sketchbooks and formulas found their way out with the retreating units. Others stayed behind, buried in the mud and rubble. Jakob, who had longed for home since his arrival, took a small, brave risk on a gray morning and slipped a note into the seam of a crate bound for a train. It simply read, "I am alive. Remember me." Whether the note reached its destination would be a separate story. When rain and sabotage reduced the output to trickles, when the men in the tunnel began to count parts and hours in the same breath, the stollen still produced, because silence above ground demanded it. In the last months, work became improvisation and salvage. Engines were cannibalized for parts. Turbine discs from earlier runs were retempered and repolished. Craft were completed with whatever could be found. The finished aircraft that rolled from the hangars and took to their brief, violent flights carried within them the invisible signatures of the stollen. The hollow blades, the carefully balanced compressors, the journals that had been honed by tired hands. After the fighting ceased, the world above the ridge changed more quickly than the men could imagine. Soldiers came to the hill. Flags were unfurled in different colors. The tunnel, so long an island removed from the sky, was exposed.
The machines, the test rigs, the lathes, and the jigs were inventoried by officers and technicians who spoke different languages. Some equipment was boxed and taken away. Some of the men were questioned, interviewed, or simply released into a Europe that was an unrecognizable map of ruins and new boundaries. Bruckner lasted through the closure of the stollen. He walked its corridors once more with a companionable numbness, touching a flange here, a rivet there, as if to assure himself that he had not dreamed the geometry of those months. He placed the torn scrap of his endurance chart into an envelope and sealed it, more for form than for hope. The metalwork he had coaxed into resilience would not be obvious in museums. The techniques would seed later industry, morph into post-war advances in turbine cooling and superalloy chemistry. He knew faintly, in that dull, post-conflict way, that their secret methods would outlive the political orders that had necessitated them. For Jakub, the end came in a small, hesitant step. He returned to his village when he could, and though the photograph of the woman and child had been smudged by soot and despair, it still held him steady. Many others did not return. Lists recorded names, numbers, the terse bureaucratic language of transfer and fate. The stollen's roster would remain a patchwork of stories. A machinist who married after the war. A foreman who emigrated west. A prisoner whose life had been shortened by pneumonia contracted in the tunnel's dust. The machine itself, the jet, survived in fragments of history. Museums would later display wing here, an engine casing there, and placards would explain in measured tones how the jet had been a technological milestone. But no exhibit could carry the stollen's damp air, the smell of heated oil, the exact way a worker balanced a blade on a spindle with his thumb. Those things belonged to memory. There is a moral complexity at the core of the stollen story that resists tidy resolution. The men who labored there accomplished feats of metallurgy and mechanical artistry that accelerated humanity's grasp on high-speed flight. Their innovations, the cooling passages, the attention to directional forging, the clarity of balancing small but violent rotating masses, fed a post-war industry that changed travel, commerce, and science. Yet, those same skills were honed within an apparatus of war that produced instruments of destruction. The few pilots who used the jets against cities or convoys did so under orders. The larger ethical questions, what is the responsibility of a craftsman when his hands make both life and death possible, linger like a shadow over the technical diagrams. In the years after, Bruckner was invited to lecture, to consult for firms that wanted to build turbines for peacetime uses, compressors for refrigeration, rotors for electricity generators, engines for transport. He found some solace in the knowledge that techniques conceived under duress could be reclaimed for peaceful purposes. But solace is not absolution. It is an uneasy accommodation. He kept the photograph of the test cell in a drawer and would take it out sometimes, as if to remind himself of the precise line where mastery had ended and consequence begun. The stollen itself became a place of pilgrimage of sorts.
Journalists and historians came with tape recorders and leathery notebooks looking for the story that could fit into a headline. Museum curators petitioned for artifacts. A few plaques were placed and then contested. The accounts varied, and with the variety came the slow layering of myth upon fact. Some retellings emphasized the technological miracle. Others focused on the human cost. Both strands were true. What remained, finally, was the testimony of objects and people. The engineered blades that had been coaxed to survive blistering air. The ledger pages stained with grease. The hands that learned to tolerate the heat. The journey from the forge's first clumsy attempts to the long-run endurance represented not merely technical learning, but a human persistence, a daily insistence upon making things hold together under impossible conditions. It is tempting, in the telling, to reduce everything to a single image, the tunnel as a womb or the jet as a beast. Those metaphors have their usefulness. They speak to the birth and the animal exigency of the machine. But they must not replace the messy particulars, the ration lines, the late-night debates over alloy percentages, the small acts of kindness between men beneath the hill. Those are the details that explain how technology becomes history, slowly, painfully, and irreversibly. The stollen's echo continues in modern turbines and in the ways engineers think about materials and cooling. The hollow blade technique, the careful choreography of metal and air, would find a home in safer skies and more constructive engines. And the memory of the men who stood at the lathes, whose names are recorded in fragmentary lists, endures as a reminder that innovation often arrives wrapped in compromise. Outside, the ridge reclaimed its face. Grass grew over the spoil heaps. Trains no longer passed the precise schedules of wartime. Below, some machines were left to rust, others were salvaged for the needs of reconstruction. A few artifacts journeyed into museums and academic libraries, where their provenance would be discussed with the care of archivists. The tunnel, once a secret artery, opened for a brief public inspection and then for closure. Visitors would stand and listen to the guide recite dates and facts, but the sound the men had made, the clink of hammer on metal, the low laugh, the held breath during a test run, had no plaque. Bruckner lived long enough to see a different kind of flight. Jets that carried people across continents, turbines that turned for electricity rather than destruction.
A plaque was bolted to the stone. Neutral, respectable language about industry and innovation, about wartime necessity and post-war reconstruction. He read no further. A woman approached him, hands thrust into the pockets of a coat too large for the season. Her hair was gray at the temples. Her eyes held the blunt, steady look of someone who had long ago learned to keep maps in her head. She did not start with a title or a demand. She said only, Herr Bruckner, and he knew, with a small, dislocated happiness, that he was being remembered not as a concept, but as a man. You knew my father, she said, Otto Keller. Bruckner's mouth formed the name before his mind could do the softer work of memory. Otto Keller, a thin-shouldered machinist who had once kept the balance of a rotor by the square of his wrist, who had tried to teach another man to thread steam-tight bolts in the half-light of a cramped bench. He felt the name like a temperature. Yes, he said, Otto. He worked nights. She left these, the woman said, and from her coat she produced an envelope the color of old paper. It bore no stamps, no date. Inside was a folded sheet of ledger paper, cramped handwriting crowded into margins, and a small photograph of a group of men at a lathe, faces dirt-streaked, collars askew, one of them laughing in a way that seemed to betray no mirth at all. Bruckner recognized the laugh. They stood there for a while, two figures near a patched mouth of a hill, and the hill kept its silence. He read the ledger and saw, within the cramped accounting, the notations that had mattered most then.
Hours counted in fractions, the coded references to material batches, the names of men who had come and gone like the weather. The paper was a map of small loyalties and cruelties. "You came to look," the woman said, "to see what they did to you." He closed his hand over the paper the way one might close over a wound to see if it still bled. "I came to remember what we had forgotten," he said. The phrase surprised him by its gentleness, and to see if remembering changes anything. She had no irony for his confession. "My mother kept one of his tools," she said, "a feeler gauge he wrapped in oilcloth. She wouldn't let it go, said it was the only thing of him that was honest." She touched the photo with a fingertip as if to feel where the laugh sat. "I wanted to know what he had said at the end." Bruckner looked into her face and back at the patched stone. The tunnel had a way of being present in small domestic things. The wrapped gauge, the ledger in a coat, the photograph tucked into a wallet. Objects that had outlived their makers and gone forward carrying rumor and truth both. He told her the story he had kept, the fatigue in the assembly line, the calculation in the margins, the way a machine could be coaxed to defy its heat for a few more minutes if a man learned to sense the exact second to strike.
He did not tell her everything. There are confessions that demand a different language than memory. But he told her enough that she nodded and folded her hands as if hearing a benediction. Word spread, always a slow, unpredictable thing, and from it came visitors whose reasons varied. Some wanted fact and chronology, professors with tidy questions about metallurgy, students who wanted to cite an origin for the hollow blade technique. Some wanted to be near the place that had once been an industry of dread. They brought candles, composed prayers, offered tokens on the patched stone. Letters came to the editorials and to the museum. Once, a man sent a set of carved wooden toys with a note that read simply, "For the children he left." The mixture of curiosity, gratitude, and accusation made a neighborhood of feelings around the stollen that could not be settled by plaques. At a small museum 30 miles away, its entrance lined with polished steel and plaque literature about progress, a curator named Marta Weiss found in an old crate of donations a device small enough to fit into her palms and complicated enough to make her hold it like a relic. It was a model blade, an experimental cross-section of the hollow idea, sealed in a case whose labels had been chewed by damp. The curator could not, at first, make sense of the marginalia beneath the technical diagrams on a yellowed sheet. A collection of short calculations, a few crude sketches in blue pencil, and one single slanted word in the corner that made her heart stop: Bruckner. Marta had the close, insistent interest of someone who has chosen archives as a way to live in other people's confidence. She took the paper to the reading room and set aside the day's schedule. She wrote letters to the university. She found, eventually, that the paper had been misfiled, passed through hands that had thought only to preserve. The paper's ink smelled faintly of oil. Her investigation became the sort of careful, patient work that can conjure an intimate public. Footnotes, interviews, inquiries across rivers and borders. She sat with Bruckner for a week in the light of an office that was too warm and drank coffee that always tasted slightly of burning. He obliged her with names and hesitations. He drew diagrams in the margin of his napkins and explained how, sometimes, the physical gesture through which one adjusted a blade told him more than the numbers. He told of a night when a rotor spun true because a man had heated a collet in his hands until it glowed. The man had used nothing but feeling to judge the right moment. Marta wrote it down. The resulting exhibit carried both. The technical diagrams were displayed next to the objects, A feeler gauge, a worn chisel, a fragment of stamped alloy. The museum's wall text made no moral proclamation. It allowed the items to sit and argue among themselves. Visitors lingered.
Two schoolchildren raced their hands along the display window and laughed. An old woman sat on a bench and wept. A veteran argued with a docent about terms, necessity, complicity, ingenuity, until the docent admitted that the terms were inadequate. The public conversation shifted then from sterile argument about innovation to something more human. What does it mean to teach a technology whose first uses were instruments of containment and harm? How should an engineer think of a technique that has saved lives and taken them? The debate had no neat resolution. People formed small alliances across coffee tables. They wrote columns in replies. They organized a symposium that intended, ambitiously, to say everything civilly. It was at that symposium that the story folded into law and liability in a way that made the abstract concrete. A modern turbine failure, one of those rare, catastrophic mid-span fractures that kill and take industry reputation in their wake, revealed during the course of an inquiry an awkward inheritance. The fracture had started at an inclusion in a blade. The laboratory analysis eventually traced that inclusion to a specific alloying process, a wartime shortcut that had been, in some cases, preserved in shop practice long after its documented use had ceased. The chain of custody did not implicate any single living perpetrator, but it did expose how practices ossify into habit. The legal hearings were dry in language and terrible in consequence. Insurance adjusters and corporate counsel played a game of name-shifting. Their voices made moral atoms of human actions. Historians entered with a different tone, intent on context and causation rather than blame. Bruckner watched the proceedings as one might watch a river change. The current was the same, the banks had moved. The family of a man who had died in the turbine failure, an assembler whose grandson had never known the smell of grease from his grandfather's hands, arrived at the museum with a petition. They asked for the record, for a speaking of the names. Their grief was not merely legal, it was a request that the living remember the dead with more than numbers. The petition read, without melodrama, that the museum should provide not only exhibits of technology, but the names and stories of those who had made it. Bruckner, whose name had been a marginal call-out on several of the archived papers, was asked to speak at a hearing that was more like a town meeting in tone. He went to the podium with a notebook in his hand, and his fingers folded around it the way a man holds a compass when he's lost. He began by refusing the easy gestures that might have sanctified or excused. "I was an instrument maker," he said. "I measured. I tried to make what we had better. I worked with men. Some of them died. Some of them were hurt. Some of them laughed. The machines do not speak, and men speak in many tongues." You can ask me about technique. You can ask me about motive. You cannot ask me to carry what history does not give. I carried what I could. The words were plain and old. It was a small, remarkable thing to stand and say, in public, that one had done one's best without pretending that the best had been good enough. Those in the hearing room who had expected confession or deflection found both in measured intervals. His descriptions of the work were technical. His asides about the men at the bench were tender. He spoke of the feeler gauge passed from hand to hand, of the man who had whistled while he checked tolerances, who had nonetheless died in a later sanitation program that never reached its wards. He read aloud, in a voice that needed no ornament, the ledger lines Otto Keller had once kept. By the time Bruckner sat down, the hearing had itself become a kind of archive, the public hydration of private memory. People spoke afterward to him with confusion pressed against gratitude. Some could not speak at all. The museum expanded an education program to include oral histories and recorded interviews. Students filed in with microphones and curiosity. They made room for voices that had not been in textbooks. Not all encounters were quiet. In the months that followed, a pair of men whose fathers had been foremen in the stollen argued fiercely on a radio panel. One claimed, with a heat that betrayed his age, that engineers had acted under orders and under impossible circumstances. To excoriate them now, he argued, was to forget the chains that bind men. The other insisted that engineers had choices, small, reputational choices that mattered, and that those choices must be examined. Each man spoke his piece and departed with his argument intact. The net of public feeling was taut, oscillating between fault and forgiveness like a blade vibrating in a test cell. Amid the public conversation, there were quieter reckonings. A small group of surviving workers, those whose faces had been long scrubbed from records but who still wore the calluses of long years, convened in a cellar hall and told stories into the dark. They laughed at themselves with a kind of astonishment. They admitted errors and celebrated small victories. The night a rotor finally held. The crude joke that broke a long silence. The kindness of a stranger who offered a piece of bread in a mess line. They did not present themselves as saints or villains. They were testament to the way daily life endures under many kinds of pressure. Bruckner, now old enough that the future often felt like a room he had once lived in, received a letter from a granddaughter of one of the late men. She had become an engineer herself in a world that took for granted the open skies of jet travel and the steady rhythm of turbines feeding cities. Her letter was not an accusation. She wanted to know how her grandfather had learned a craft in a place that taught so many conflicting things. Bruckner wrote back with the care of a man answering an exam he had not expected to pass. He described the way the machines measured human patience and the way the men measured the machines. He wrote, too, of moments of shame and of mercy, of hands warmed by coffee and hands guided by a steady explanation. The granddaughter visited once, with a small child on her hip. They walked the path to the patched entrance. The child ran in circles like a sparrow, and the woman watched him with the gentle, exhausted attention of a parent. They stood at the plaque and read the sober words. "We owe our speed to many things," Bruckner said, "and there is no ledger that can ever fully account for the cost." The woman nodded. "Then we make new ledgers," she said. "We teach differently. We tell the whole story." There was a particular afternoon when the hill spoke in a way that even Bruckner had not anticipated. A storm arrived early, a narrow, ringing rain that sharpened sound. The patter on leaves was a drum. The path slickened to a sheen. In that weather, the museum's new oral history team arranged to bring a small group of children to the site. The idea was simple: to place the past before those whose future would be shaped by such stories. Two of the children were the grandchildren of former stollen workers. One carried with him, tucked into the lining of his jacket, a small wooden toy carved by his grandfather. The guide, an older woman who had herself been a technician for years, told them about tolerances and about time. She described, in terms children could hold, what it meant for two things to fit together so exactly that they could not be separated without breaking one. The children listened and asked the kind of blunt questions that make adults uncomfortable. "Did people ever steal parts?" one asked. "Did their fingers get stuck?" another. The guide answered with a clarity that pleased Bruckner. People did wrong things. People did right things. They were tired sometimes. They were brave sometimes. The child with the toy held it up and asked if brave things were the same as good. Bruckner saw in his smallness the nut of the old problem: how to teach future hands to be both skilled and moral. That evening, after the children had gone and rain had polished the sky,
Bruckner sat at the edge of the hill and imagined the rotor blades he had once coaxed to life. Then imagined the children who would one day learn about them in classrooms, perhaps in lessons that weighed craft and conscience as equal parts. He thought of the men whose names lived in ledgers and letters, and of the way objects traveled into museums and into pockets, and carried with them the smell of oil and the warmth of hands. The wind moved across the ridge, and the world felt, for a moment, like a wheel turning on an axle that had known both strain and grace. There was no settling the ledger into a single page.
The conversation would continue in columns and classrooms, in technical standards and in lectures about ethics. The techniques born under the hill would keep evolving. The hollow blade would find safer geometries and more reliable metallurgies. But the human record, the ledger of names, of jokes, of children and tools, found a small, permanent place in public memory. When Bruckner finally left the museum office that night, he carried with him a copy of the ledger Otto Keller had kept. He placed it in a drawer, not to bury it, but to keep it close. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before sleep, he would open it and trace the shorthand scribbles and imagine the hands that had made them. He could forgive technical ingenuity without forgetting the men who had paid for it. He still bore a weight of responsibility, less the legal sort than the personal gravity of a life spent shaping force, but it had changed shape. It was now a lightness of sorts, an awareness that what one teaches in the machine shop becomes part of a lineage that will outlast any single regime or conscience. Years later, when Bruckner's heart grew slow and the house insisted on a quiet that had nothing to do with sleep, the museum created an outreach program. They asked him to teach a small seminar for apprentices, a handful of young technicians who wanted not only to learn how to measure and fit, but also to learn the old small mercies. How to pass along tools, how to tell the story of a machine with its human context attached. He agreed, partly out of habit, and partly because the offer felt like a chance to speak where it mattered. On the first day of class, he stood before a table scattered with parts and tools, old and new side by side, and he told them the simplest story he knew. "You will learn how to bend metal and make it speak," he said. "You will learn the numbers that keep turbines steady. But remember this, the rest, the mercy, the patience, the way you hand a tool to the next person, those are also part of the job." The apprentices listened with that mixture of skepticism and hunger that youth has for truth. One of them, a young woman with grease beneath her fingernails, asked if engineers could change the use of things. Bruckner thought of all the ways the Stollen's work had been repurposed. He said, yes, not by forgetting what it was used for, but by using what it can be used for now. The class folded into practice sessions. Bruckner's gestures were economical and exact. He taught them to feel balance, to listen for the faint harmonic of a rotor, to understand why a small nick left unchecked becomes a catastrophe. He taught them, too, to read a ledger as more than numbers, as evidence of people who had lived in the shadow of a machine. They learned to measure not only load and stress, but context and consequence.